a principle of justice. Myanmar and other least developed countries have contributed so little to the climate crisis, and yet we are suffering the impacts of climate now. We are in a stage where we are unable to rebound to address the impacts of climate crisis because of colonial legacies that have fragmented our countries. LDCs are very, very highly conflicted because there have been colonial legacies that have dismantled our ethnic groups, our unity, and our institutional structures, our bureaucracy and our fiscal structures. And so it is a matter of justice for us to get grants. And the reason we need grants now is because the colonial legacies have made our countries appear too risky to fund and crowd in resources to address the impacts of climate change. So what we end up getting with loans is we are going to put ourselves into a greater and perpetual risk of debt, which is going to perpetuate the colonial legacies of the past, where we are paying back continually to the funders that have caused instability in our countries and our regions. So the duty bearers need to give us grants now so that we can restore the institutions that have been broken as a result of past historic wrong. It's not a matter of charity, but a right to correct the historical wrongs. And please don't tell us that there's not enough money for grants, because there is enough, and there are fossil fuel subsidies in the trillions that can easily fund us, as well as money going to the military that can substantially fund our institutions and create civic space, provide the public services that we need in order to really combat climate change. And who will we give the grants to? Like I mentioned before, we will give the grants to a diversity of actors and restore civic space and bureaucracies and institutions in our country. We will give them to NGOs who understand the context on the ground. We will give them to local governments who need institutions to be built and create civic space. And we will give them to innovative smallholder farmers and businesses so that they can actually learn to innovate and fill the space for future generations. And the reason we need grants now is really important because, I lost my train of thought. We need to create a track record so that we can crowd in non-grant funding in the future. But for the moment, because we are fragile and conflict affected and really highly vulnerable to climate change, we need the grants to create the institutions that we need now.
Look, it's on now. I was just introducing myself. My name is Melissa Garvey. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. It's just thank you for the opportunity to do this debate today. Super fun. And I want to start by saying, May, we do agree with you. It wasn't just it wasn't a stock response. We agree. We wish that there was sufficient grant funding that could cover the needs of all LDCs in a way that could help them be able to build their institutions and be able to create the enabling conditions to be successful over the long term. But that's not the political world that we live in right now, unfortunately. And there's an urgent need to scale up financing for climate action that will be also supporting the social justice needs that are associated with the adaptation. So, ideally we would have sufficient grants, but in a world where we don't, we need to ensure that there is a wide spectrum of opportunities that have varying terms, different kinds of support to be able to maximize and leverage the resources that can be put to climate finance. And ideally much of that would also be concessional support. We also identified that there's a key weakness in the model of typically having the government be the primary recipient of grants, which is often how these resources are distributed. And there's an enormous appetite from others to be able to access, whether it's things like low interest loans or other resources. So the private sector, financial institutions, households, typically these folks are shut out of access from grant funding. And so again, there's a need to have there be other mechanisms, other ways to be able to ensure that you've got the financial resources in the hands of those who can actually make change effectively, quickly, and durably over time. So we have identified a whole suite of solutions that could be addressing the unique needs of the particular places. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. We had identified a broad list from carbon markets to insurance mechanisms, microfinance, as well as things like debt conversions, which is something that I spend a lot of time on. But the idea is that you need those that can provide both the sort of immediate financial resources as well as those that can have the medium and longer term support, so that you can be both building the institutional arrangements that are necessary to be reconfiguring the economic system in a country to be able to receive those funds in a way to put them to work. So again, ideally we'd have all the loans, or excuse me, not loans. Ideally we would have all the grant funding that would be necessary, but not only is that not the world that we live in, that there's also a need to have there be different kinds of solutions that meet the different needs of the people and places that are all affected by climate impacts.
Yeah, I mean, our answer is possibly a slightly glib one, which is that case has already been made, and it is happening, and there is support going to those countries that's purely on grant terms, precisely because of the fragile and conflict context, but it's probably not at the scale that's actually required, and that the financing, increasingly in such context wouldn't go to the government at all. You don't want the financing to go to the government because you don't want to be essentially financing civil war or arms or whatever it may be, given that money is fungible. So in fact, in practice, a lot of the financing would go directly through, for example, the UN system, implementing partners like WFP or UNFPA, UNICEF, etc. Not much of that in such settings would necessarily, though, be for climate action. I think it's going to be for other more pressing and immediate humanitarian needs in the first instance. Unfortunately, not really about building long-term sustainable solutions. So that's our answer. Am I along the right lines? As I said earlier, we agree with you entirely.
Now it's on. What was your question? Okay, the clock is ticking. The time is now. We've got no time to waste. You have already promised to radically reform the finance architecture. Mere Motley has got your word you will do this. We have to tax the rich. We have to tax oil and gas and not subsidize them. We have to fix the politics through actually going through the reform process for these subsidies, and we saw that in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, having actually created a Republican lobby for renewables that we are seeing in action right now. We can do this, and we did it for COVID. We had the special drawing rights. We had quantitative easing. These are the things we need to marshal right now to help the LDCs.
When we work with the grants, if we use grants in contexts where there are companies, we are in a way subsidizing the companies, and then we may distort the market, and we may actually make it more difficult competing with existing companies in the country. And so I think sometimes it may be good to think about alternative instruments which can create more sustainable market-based development as well.
Great, thank you very much. Claire?
I really like the argument that you just need everything. You need all the tools, you need all the actors. It was just like, yeah, that's why I was in the middle in the first place.
Maybe just to quickly say, I also often advocate for grants coming from Canada, but I think, you know, this has inspired me to think more about knowing that Canada provides a lot of loans in their climate finance, to look more at what are those loans, how are, or you know, other modes of finance that they're using. How can we encourage the best modes of finance for the best situations for least developed countries?
This was great as a session, so thanks to the organizers. I think what it really kind of brought through was playing back the country context, and I think that was the question which we were fearing, like when you kind of posed it to us, because you just have to kind of play it back in terms of the country kind of context to think about, gosh, what innovative kind of financial mechanism could be utilized in this. So we got our creative minds thinking, but it was also really challenging to kind of think of it in that context. And I think there's something here for clearly the negotiating rooms to kind of consider when it comes to kind of LDC needs in playing back the hard reality in certain country contexts.
I think it would be also. I think it would be also nice not to think only about LDCs, but also SIDS. And it was really nice for you to say that LDCs are not all the same, but of course, in the sake of these negotiations, they appear as a group. But for the SIDS, it's the same, and the SIDS now want to do this multi-vulnerable, the IMF, the index, a specific index, so they can also access financing with different conditions. So I think that these variables will appear more and more to really see which ones are the most vulnerable, not only inside the LDCs, but also the SIDS, and even in the graduated, those that graduated, that are now, you know, having not, Cabo Verde is one of these issues, I'm working there, and it's really bad to see them somehow punished by the success of development. So they are really good now in education, they are really good on health, and now they don't have access to grants. And so it's like they are somehow getting a setback because of this. So I think that this is also some things that we could discuss in future debates.
Thank you. Andres, you want to say something?
Thank you. Just a quick reflection on my side. I think that the conversation is sometimes overly simplified when we think of who are the recipients or the potential recipients of finance, and we say, of course, it should be LDCs and SIDS, but we never think of how finance needs to reach local levels like communities or vulnerable groups, and that's not only LDCs and SIDS. And I feel like when we talk about LDCs and SIDS, we assume, for instance, that middle-income countries should not be the target of grants. And we've been working in the last couple of years on thinking how we get finance to the local level. And it's not an easy conversation when we think of just countries or governments as the main beneficiaries of finance and not looking at the broader spectrum of who should also access something that is not easily accessible.
We're going to take the penultimate reflection from Shruti and then go to David.
Thank you. So I was thinking when we were creating our arguments and then heard yours, and I was always on like, okay, 70% grant side, but rest is like we need everything. But what I was reflecting on is I always have my fundraiser hat on, and I'm not always asking the questions about what beyond grants, that if anything that we're working on, have we thought of the life cycle of this beyond grants? And probably that was my reflection, that I should be thinking a lot more about it and trying to ask those questions internally, externally, that have we thought about it beyond what we are looking at right now? So thank you, this was a great exercise.
Well done, guys.
Thanks, yeah, a great exercise. I think one thing that I reflect on is how quickly we got into sort of discussion about a volume of finance, not on what we spend it on, and we get into a negotiation about the volume of finance, not what we spend the grant on. or the concessionary loan on, we focus on volume rather than on quality. And I think we can actually make a much stronger case if we can demonstrate these are excellent projects to fund, whether they're grant or loan, but we focus on volume, and that's where other people are negotiating on volume, not on necessarily on quality.
Thank you. Really great reflections. Demonstrates that I think, May, your plan of getting people to debate against each other has worked. People seem to have learned from each other. And of course, thank you to both teams for being such great sports. And I'll hand over to May to close the session.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think it's always great to challenge the positions with which we hold near and dear to our hearts, especially around grants, or carbon markets or debt swaps, whatever it is that we are passionate about and we advocate for. We really try to hold on to those messages, but I think this kind of exercise is really great in learning other people's perspectives, and then also just reframing your brain a little bit occasionally about what the other person is thinking. And maybe this is a good exercise for us to put our heads into the people in the negotiations room who are going through these things right now and really thinking about how do we represent our countries, our negotiation blocks, in advocating for these positions. So yeah, I'm really glad that we had the debate here at D&C Days. So I think we can break a bit early. I don't know how we're going to declare a clear winner. We seem to think we have won.